To create a footing for your cup, the first thing you're going to do is take some extra clay and you're going to roll it into a coil. So on my sheet here, I'm just going to show you, I'm just going to roll it into a coil. A coil is going to look like a long snake. I do not want it to be too thick. It does not need to be very thick. So I'm going to roll it out on my desk, on my table, and I'm going to make it nice and thin. Each time I roll it out, it's getting thinner and thinner. The purpose of this coil is to go on the bottom of your the bottom of your mug. The reason we put a footing on mugs and bowls and plates is to give your cup also a pretty bottom, but also the ceramic mugs, when you put them in the kiln, if once you have glazed them, if you don't have a footing on it, the footing is actually what's going to hold your, it's going to sit on the kiln shelf. When it's on the kiln shelf and you have glazed it, the footing is the only thing that does not get glazed. So what happens when you have it in the kiln and your footing is on the very bottom, you glaze all of these other areas, and then that little footing is going to be the area that doesn't get glazed and it sits on the kiln shelf. Let's say you glaze the bottom of your mug and you don't have a footing. Your mug is then going to stick to the bottom of the shelf. So if it's going to sit on the bottom of the shelf, it's going to get stuck. It's going to stay there, and it's not going to be able to come off without breaking your mug. Okay, so we create a footing. So right now I have a nice flat bottom. I'm just going to tap it a little bit and smooth out some of those little rough edges. I want to make that bottom just right. I want to make sure my sides are just right, nice and smooth and angled. Use my fingers for kind of that finishing detail to smooth it out. All right, when you're adding a footing, you're going to need a couple of different tools. You're going to need a needle tool and you're going to need slip. All right, so with your slip is going to act as a ceramic glue. So in order for your footing to stick, you're going to need that ceramic glue or that slip. Notice that what I'm doing here is I'm scratching the surface of the bottom of my mug, only around the rim, okay? In order for this added piece of clay to stick, I am going to scratch the surface. Here you can see it a little bit better. I've scratched the rim, and then I'm going to add some slip. So slip is where you are just taking some really wet clay and you are applying it either with a paintbrush or your finger to the area that you just scratched. So when you take that slip, you want to get a little bit of a chunk of it. You don't necessarily want it to be thin. You don't necessarily want it to be thick, kind of in between, okay? So now you can see it looks like it's wet, but you can tell that I added something to it, okay? You can tell that it's not just water that I added. It's actually just really wet clay. All right, so I'm going to take my coil that I'm rolling out. I'm going to redo it again because the other one got a little too thin. It doesn't have to be perfect, and I'll explain why as we're doing it. One thing that you want to do when you are working with your clay is you want to make sure that you are kind of consistent. So my entire coil is about the same size from top to bottom. It is rounded, but it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to be shaping this coil once I get it on my cup. I'm also going to scratch, or in other words, score that little coil before I add it. So I scratched the surface of the cup, and I'm scratching the surface of my coil. This is a pretty thick coil, no big deal. Now what I'm going to do is I want to add it to the top. I have a little bit of leftover, so I'm going to trim that off and set that to the side. And I'm going to use this extra piece here. I want to make sure that it's nice and smooth. So I kind of removed a little bit. I'm going to stick a little slip in between those two pieces and scratch or score them as well. Okay, so now I have added what looks like just a round circle to the bottom of my mug. All right, so this next step, I'm going to take my paddle and I'm going to tap it down just a bit just to flatten it. And next, I'm going to be using my needle tool to kind of shape this area. All right, so when you're using your needle tool, or this one's a sculpture tool, it's very similar to a needle tool. What I'm doing is I'm going to hold that needle tool straight up and down. Let me get a little closer so you guys can see. I'm going to hold that tool straight up and down. And I want to make sure my mug or my bowl is centered on my banding wheel. And now I'm going to allow that banding wheel to spin. And I'm holding my little needle tool straight up and down. And I'm letting the banding wheel spin. And that's going to help me make a nice circle. Now I'm peeling off the extra layers that I don't need. What I'm doing here is I'm reshaping that edge because that coil that I put on, it was not perfect. And they usually never are. Okay, so now I have added that little bit of detail by making this nice and smooth. And watch, I'm going to take my finger and just kind of smooth that out a little bit more. Okay? Now I'm going to go on the inside and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm spinning my wheel. I'm holding my needle tool nice and straight up and down. And now I'm going to pull the rest off.